Good evening, everyone. So I'm very happy to introduce for a second time my good friend and colleague, Rabbi Annette Koch, who is going to continue our three-part series on Yiddish culture. And tonight, it's going to be poetry and story tonight. Next time, we're going to talk about Bintelbrief. Okay.
Among other things, many other things.
All right. So I'm going to spotlight Rabbi Koch, and she will lead us tonight.
It's fine. It's a three-part program that gives us a little bit of an overview on the highlights of and a little bit of the history of Yiddish civilization and culture. And so, just as a follow-up to last week's program, people were very surprised that the zodiac was mentioned in Gluckel's book, right? And in fact, in the traditional world, if somebody announces that they're going to have a baby, you would never in a million years say Mazel Tov. The Mazal means the zodiac. You would say B'Sha'a Tova, meaning may it happen at a propitious time under the zodiac. The zodiac was a big part of the ancient Jewish milieu. And there is a synagogue, 4th century, well, some of the resources said maybe 4th or 6th, in an area called Bet Shean. The synagogue is called Beit Alpha, and it has an exquisite mosaic zodiac on the floor. If you ever get to northern Israel, make sure you go see it because it's gorgeous. But the zodiac was a part of the culture, not a part of the traditional belief system, but it's embedded. It's absolutely embedded. I think that was the only thing hanging over from last time that we kind of left open. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started taking a look at the next period that we are in. Oops. So today we have finally reached the modern period. Remember, we talked about the period of Old Yiddish and then a couple of others. And we're going to do the period from 1750 to the present. And the areas we're going to talk about are poetry and story. We're actually going to talk about stories first. And this is the same chart I had up the last time. And we are now in this box, the lower right-hand box, right? So early Yiddish, we don't have a lot of written documents. Old Yiddish, there are a few, but very, very few. Middle Yiddish, this is where we find Gluckel stuff and some other things. And it takes us through the middle of the 17th century, really. And from the middle of the 17th century, we get into what some call New Yiddish, others call the modern period. And that's here. And we were going to talk about Nachman of Bratslav last week, but I have rolled him over to this week because he is a transitional figure for us, and he's really interesting. Here's another picture of that timeline a different way. Some of us are need pictures instead of words, so I brought this back as well. And there are a couple of things going on in the modern period. I added a few, which I'll mention again as we go through. So Yiddish is a Sprach. Yiddish is a language. Geschichte und Poesie. Story and poetry. And again, this wonderful alphabet card from when I was going to the Yud Lamed Peretz Alpetering Schule, where I learned to read and write Yiddish. I'm a native Yiddish speaker. I spoke Yiddish before I spoke English. So English I picked up on the streets. That might explain why occasionally I stumble. But anyway, that's supposed to be a joke in case. And the interesting additional letters that are part of the Yiddish alphabet, because it includes the sounds from those languages it picked up as the Jewish people were driven out of certain countries and into others. This is another map I showed you last time. That is the image of what was called the Yiddish civilization, the countries where Yiddish was spoken. and it extends all the way from Germany through Central Europe to Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the northern states of Estonia and Latvia, and parts of Russia. Places where Yiddish was spoken in the middle and modern periods. But there are some changes coming about. Remember that there were lots of Jews in Spain, lots of Jews in France, lots of Jews in Italy, but they didn't really leave behind the spoken languages of the area where they were living. They adopted those local languages. Of course, then people who were driven to the east were driven back west and brought Yiddish with them, the whole mindset. So where are we? We're in the middle of the 18th century. Glockel takes us right to the beginning of the 18th century, and we head toward the middle of the 18th century, where we find that Hasidism, or Hasidische, Hasidism, has blossomed. The Baal Shem Tov and the various courts that were established by the Baal Shem Tov students, but they were teaching in Hebrew. They were teaching and they were speaking Yiddish to one another, but teaching in Hebrew. Along comes Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. He was born in 1772. So you see, we're already in the 18th century. He was born in Poland, a part of Poland that is now part of Ukraine. The great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. Married, some of you were shocked that Glockel was engaged at 12 and married at 14. Well, Rabbi Nachman has one on her because he was married at 13. He and his wife had 8 children, only a few of whom survived. And he wasn't really excited about becoming a Hasidic teacher. But he did manage to make a trip to what's referred to as the Holy Land, what we call Israel now, in 1798. So again, I call him a life lived on the cusp, because he was living in the heart of Eastern Europe. It was the world of shtetls and Yiddish speakers, but a lot was going on in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. When he comes back, his enthusiasm for teaching and for helping to bring a Jewish connection to God has now been energized by his trip to Israel. And in 1802, he settles in a town that is called Bratslav. And that is why we know him as Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. And among the basic things of Rabbi Nachman's teaching is how easy it is for the human being to feel distanced from God, and how hard it is sometimes to struggle through the challenges of everyday life. But as he says, the most important thing is not to be afraid. What's unique about Rabbi Nachman is that he taught in Yiddish and he wrote in Yiddish also. Why? Because the people he wanted to reach couldn't read Hebrew. He wasn't interested in reaching only the more educated folks. He was interested in reaching the everyday people who only spoke and read and wrote in Hebrew. And I brought a map to show us where Breslau or Bratslav is, because when we asked where Hamlin was, and I know where Hamlin is now, I didn't know last week. So it's kind of right here, smack in the toward the western, but also central Ukraine. This area right into here is Russia. This is Georgia. Here's the Crimean Peninsula, and Bratslav is right there. What we have here, because he was such a charismatic teacher, died very young, is first of all a picture of his tomb in the picture in the city of Uman. He didn't live his entire life in Bratslav. His last years were lived in Uman. And he never appointed a successor. There has never been a successor. So he was radically different from the rest of the Hasidic movement. Again, we have to think about what's going on in the late 18th and early 19th century. Died in 1812, 19th century. What's going on during this period? I'm going to talk a little bit about it. This is a picture of a page from a book of his stories, Sipure, and it's bilingual. On the left, and it's an old, so Yiddish on the left. So on the left column on each page is Yiddish, but it's an older form of Yiddish, and it's very hard for me to read. On the right is the Hebrew version, for those who didn't want to or couldn't read Yiddish. And on the bottom is commentary in Rashi script. A different font is used for the commentary so that we won't get it confused with the text. His grave is still visited, and the Bratzlaver Hasidim do not have another rabbi. They only had and will always only have one rabbi. So what was it about Rabbi Nachman that is so enchanting? So I brought us a story. The story is called The Treasure. It's missing one sentence at the bottom. I have that on the next slide. But I was hoping that somebody would volunteer to maybe read the first paragraph, and we'll get a few people to read. There are a few things I'm going to read because there's so much Yiddish in them, it's hard. But would somebody volunteer to read the first paragraph, or should I just?
Carol Lee is volunteering.
Oh,
I'll
thank
volunteer.
you. Okay.
Oh, The Treasure. A man once dreamed that there was a great treasure under a bridge in Vienna. He traveled to Vienna and stood near the bridge, trying to figure out what to do. He did not dare search for the treasure by day because of the many people who were there. Do you want me to go on?
Well, is there someone else who'd like to read? Anybody else?
Why don't you go on, Carol Lee?
Please,
Okay.
Carolee, thank you.
An officer passed by and asked, "What are you doing, standing here and contemplating?" The man decided that it would be best to tell the whole story and ask for help, hoping that the officer would share the treasure with him. He told the officer the entire story. I'll continue. The officer replied, "A Jew is concerned only with dreams. I also had a dream, and I also saw a treasure. It was in a small house under the cellar." In relating his dream, the officer accurately described the man's city and house. He rushed home, dug under his cellar, and found the treasure. He said, "Now I know that I had the treasure all along. But in order to find it, I had to travel to Vienna."
So I'm going to stop sharing for a second so we can all see each other. What's this story about? What's Rabbi Nachman trying to teach us? This was originally told and originally transcribed in Yiddish. It's a Yiddish story. Is it different from the way Gluckel writes? What kinds of similarities are there to the way Gluckel was writing? Any responses to this story? What does it make you think? Anybody?
Well, he's looking for the treasure that really is in his own home. So it's really amongst what he already had. Why he had to travel to find it, maybe he didn't realize the goodness he had at home and had to travel someplace else to find the goodness in his own life. Maybe.
That's a great interpretation. Rabbi?
It actually makes me think of the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy, right? Dorothy has to travel to Oz and go through all these adventures to realize there's no place like home, and it's all right there, and she didn't see it.
Right. So he had to leave home to realize that the real treasures were the things that he had at home, right? There's no place like home. Any other ideas? Well, I'm going to share with you screen again. So this is the full version of the story as Rabbi Nachman told it. The version that we read a minute ago that leads us to there's no place like home interpretation is how I learned this story originally, how I heard it the first time, and how I've been telling it for years. But in researching for the program, I came upon a dual language edition of Rabbi Nachman's stories in English and Yiddish, and also English versions of the story that have the full story as he actually told it. Carolee, would you read this part down here that I had cut out from the first version? He said, in order to find it, I had to travel to Vienna. You're muted, Carolee.
Yes. I had to travel to Vienna. The same is true in serving God. Each person has the treasure, but in order to find it, he must travel to the tzaddik.
Does that change the way we understand the story? It's very different. It's very different. Rabbi Nachman was a mystic, and his ideas about spirituality were tied up not only in the individual, but in the individual's relationship with their teachers. And it was really important to him. One of the things he said was that he was very aware of the fact that the Enlightenment in Europe had started in the 17th century. In the 1600s with people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, David Hume, Francis Bacon. There was this whole new movement of thinking and focused on rationalism, focused on, they were theists, they were deists, but they were anti-superstition and anything that they thought was superstitious religion, and focused on science, the here and now. And Rabbi Nachman was very aware of that, very aware of it. We don't see it reflected in the first story. We see a little bit of it reflected in this one. And he is quoted as having said that the world is changing and a great wave of atheism is coming. And he understood the Enlightenment. He knew what was coming. He could see how the world was changing. The Enlightenment comes to the European Jewish community a century late, where it starts in the 17th century in Western Europe. It really comes to the Jews of Eastern Europe in the 18th century. So I have just a little bit of summary here, the Old Yiddish period with the pogroms that push people east. And in the 17th and 18th century, we get, in addition to the development of Hasidism, we get the development of what's called the Haskalah. It's the Jewish version of the Enlightenment. So you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and others in Western Europe. And in Eastern Europe, you have German thinkers, and among them, Moses Mendelssohn, a Yiddish Enlightenment thinker of the Haskalah. And their focus is the same. It's rationalism and science and education. It's also assimilation. And in order to be truly enlightened, according to the Haskalah, philosophers and teachers and thinkers, you have to stop speaking in that debased jargon they call Yiddish and adopt the language of the country you're in. And they encourage people to start learning the local languages, German, Polish, Russian, Romanian, wherever they are. And Yiddish in the Western countries really does atrophy. So we don't have the same kind of Yiddish speaking energy in France and Spain and the other Western European countries as we do in Eastern Europe. The problem is Eastern Europeans are stubborn and they're not terribly educated. The Haskalah in Eastern Europe encourages the abandonment of what they call the jargon, the jargon, a loudish country, but a loudish language, they called it. But I wrote down at the bottom, Yiddish is a seductress. and soon becomes the lingua franca of the modern Yiddish literature culture. Because the teachers of the Haskalah, who call themselves maskilim, want to reach the greatest number of people they can with their new ideas about rationalism and education and science. But these folks speak Yiddish. So what do? They start writing in Yiddish on the assumption that once they reach people, they won't need to write in Yiddish anymore, because everyone will start learning the sophisticated languages of the lands in which they live. Quite the opposite happens. And we get the development of modern Yiddish. So we're in the period of modern Yiddish, and around the middle of the 19th century, our writers who are masculine, they start out as masculine, they get traditional Jewish religious educations, but they are exposed to the thoughts of the Enlightenment. They become masculine, but they need to reach the common people. And they start writing in Yiddish and are seduced by it. The great founders of the Yiddish of the movement in Yiddish language and literature are Mendele Moicher Sforim, Sholem Aleichem, and Yud Lamed Peretz, I.L. Peretz, who are considered the fathers of modern Yiddish literature. Back to our map. I don't know if you remember, I showed this a few minutes ago, and I have a blue circle here instead of a red one because the red one is now broken. Yiddish civilization extended all the way to the borders between Germany and France and Italy and included this area of Central Europe, but no longer. The Jews of this Central European area did really abandon Yiddish and adopted the language of the countries where they were living. So our circle of Yiddish civilization gets smaller. It includes Poland, Romania, the Ukraine, Belarus, the Slovak countries, and chunks of Russia. But the emphasis has shifted east. So Mendele Moicher Sforim, Yiddish writer, born in 1835, who once again bridges for us from the 19th century to the early 20th century. And he's with his partners in crime, Shlomo. So here's Mendele Moicher Sforim was that's him. It's a pen name. His name was Shalom Yankiv Abramovich. He started writing in the voice of a character called Mendele the bookseller, Mendele Moicher Sforim. And if you speak Hebrew, it's Forim, right? It's Farim, books. And Mocher, a seller of books, with Shalom Aleichem and, oh boy, I can't find my mouse again. There it is. Shalom Aleichem, Mordechai Rabinovich Ben Ami, and Chaim Nachman Bialik, friends of his. They all knew each other really well. And S.Y. Abramovich was universally acknowledged as the founder of modern artistic prose in both Hebrew and Yiddish. Very quickly, he had a traditional education, but he also had a secular education and became part of the masculine community and originally wrote in Hebrew. And he adopted their ideas, and he was a firm believer in the power of education. His goal was to banish mysticism, not religion, but the aspects of religion that he considered superstition. He wanted the Jews to adopt pure religion. But he wasn't reaching anybody. So he started writing in Yiddish, in the voice of Mendele Moicher Sforim. We're going to look at some excerpts from one of his books called Fischke der Krimer, Fischke the Lame, who's a simple-minded, disabled person who is telling his story to of his life in the underworld to members of the lower middle class. Mendele the book peddler, and Alter, another bookseller. Who turns out to be the real mensch? The criminal, Fishke, the one without the formal education. And we see a change in Mendele Moicher-Sforum's attitude toward people and who he thinks it's important to write about. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff about his use of language and the way he writes, but I'm going to stop sharing here and go into a different share because I promised that I would show the texts in a format where I could make them as big as you need them to be so you could see them. And what it says here is Mendele Moicher-Sforum, Maisis Binyamin Hashlishi. There are two novellas in here. One is Benjamin III and Fishke der Krümmer, Fishke the Cripple. Here's a version from a bilingual edition from Syracuse University, where it's in Hebrew, in Yiddish and in English. But I'm going to go to the prologue. This is from an all English translation. And this is the prologue of the book, ostensibly being spoken by Mendele. So I'll read a little of it, if that's okay with everybody, unless somebody would really like to read. I don't see a lot of enthusiasm for reading here. So I'm going to read a little of this prologue to this book about Fishke der Krümmer, who is a criminal. But this is Mendele, and Abramovich ultimately only goes by Mendele Moicher-Sforum. It's as if he becomes his pseudonym. Ma shmechem, so what's your name? That's the first thing one Jewish gent says to another. The translator here is trying to really give us a feel for the way Mendele wrote. And he was writing very colloquially and also in a kind of earlier Yiddish, not quite as modern as what we use now. The first thing one Jewish gent says to another, and a total stranger to boot, the minute he has slipped him the glad hand and unplugged a howdy do. And it never even entered anybody's head at the time to say, now, sir, what makes you so all-fired eager on a sudden to know my name? Are we maybe thinking of becoming related by marriage? I go by the name it pleased them as named me to call me, and there's an end. Why, gracious no, it's a perfectly normal question, and quite in the ordinary nature of things. Say, like giving someone's new caftan an appreciative pat and asking, how much a yard? Or like cadging a smoke, just when someone's got his tobacco pouch open, like poking your fingers into someone's snuff box and helping yourself to a pinch, like easing your foot over into someone else's tub and dipping in a sweaty old handkerchief and sort of giving yourself one of them general all over rub downs with it. It's like sidling over to where two people are having a cozy chat and cupping an ear to listen, or like suddenly asking somebody clear out of the blue, how's business? And then heaping all sorts of advice on him when he has got absolutely no use for it and can do just as well without. I can make this bigger for you guys if that will help. This sort of thing and others I could name happen all the time. They are part of the scheme of things from way back when, and to take exception would be, well, a bit mad and savage, if not downright unnatural. Not only in this life, but in the next too. We Jewish folks like to think that no sooner have we got our foot past the door than the first thing out of the guardian angel's mouth is, Ma shmechem, cuz. And the angel that wrestled Jacob, our father, well, even he wouldn't deviate from the custom and asked his name right off. So if that's the angel's way, what's to expect from ordinary mortal folk like you and me? Now, I'm sure that on my first venture, so to speak, into Yiddish literature, the first thing folks are bound to ask me is, Ma shmechem, Gramps?
Very cute.
So what do you think? The father of modern Yiddish literature, in the voice of his own character. How does this strike you? How does it align with your expectations of what this might read like?
It's got a little of Damon Runyon in it.
Yeah, a little bit, a little bit. It gets better. We're going to look at another little piece.
That's
Sorry.
not bad.
It doesn't seem very sophisticated.
No, it doesn't, does it? You're muted, Carolee.
I don't think it's supposed to be sophisticated at all.
No, I know.
Yeah.
But it's not.
No, it sounds to me like something you want to continue to read. Okay, so he's asking the name and asking why. Okay, what's going to happen next?
It was creating interest, but
Yes.
this is the character speaking here isn't even the main character of the story. It's not Fishke. It's Mendelith. The narrator, the writer of the story. It's the author talking to us in this character of Mendelith.
It sounds to me like if I remember correctly, my grandmother using the term Bobemaisa, where it's a roundabout way of getting to the point. I mean, I think the term Bobemaisa is that correct? Get to the point. Don't give me all this extraneous stuff. Get to the point.
Get to the point. But if he cut right to the chase and got to the point, Mashmeachem, Mendelith, what would there be in the way of a story?
Yeah.
What kind of people is he writing about? Let's take a look at another little snippet. Another snippet from the bilingual page. We are now out of the prologue, but Mendel is still talking. And he has run into his friend, Alter. Alter is a Yoderek Yidel mit a dick Beichel. Anybody want to read?
I'll read if you want to give you a
Okay,
break.
thank you. That would be great.
Now, this time, Reb Alter was no other than my old crony, Wine and Candles, Alter. This being kind of his trade moniker, don't you know? Who is a very burly, thick-set Jewish gent, well girthed about the middle, with a great heap of grimy ginger yellow hair on him, which could have kept half a dozen Jewish gentlemen, besides himself, in full-face whiskers and side curls, easy. That is, if he was ever minded to be generous and part with any of it. Anyway, this frowsy mess of carroty hair and whiskers is parted in the middle by a broad, fleshy promontory, serving old Wine and Candles for a nose, which article is stopped up for pretty near most of the year. So as a rule, Alter doesn't get much wear out of it generally, and it mainly kind of just sits there, more or less at a loose end, without doing much of anything, so you'd notice.
I see a couple of,
I was going to say, a little sarcastic.
a little, you think? To remind you of any Jewish comedians you used to listen to?
Jackie Mason.
Jackie Mason, who else? A whole bunch of them, all the Borscht Belt guys. All the Borscht Belt, that sarcastic, cutting, biting sense of Jewish humor. But-
Somebody by the name of Katz.
Oh, Mickey Katz. There were a bunch of them. There were a whole bunch of them. He's doing a couple things here. Is he writing an erudite philosophical treatise?
Nope.
Oh,
Who's he describing? What kind of people?
It's ordinary people, right?
Yeah.
Just your
book is
average
subtitled-
run-of-the-mill Joe.
Yeah, this book is subtitled The Book of Stories About the Poor People.
uh,
Other people weren't writing about them. They
oh.
weren't writing about what we could call the common man, the ordinary person, the people you would meet on market day in the streets, in the Shtetlach of 19th century Europe, Eastern Europe. That's who he's writing about. And he's creating this incredible set of images. And we're going to look at somebody else who wrote about the common man. And the thing about Mendel Amacher Svarim, he starts this business of writing in Yiddish so that he can get the attention of the Yiddish speakers and convince them that science and education is the way to go, that rationalism is the way to go, and that they all should stop speaking Yiddish and start speaking whatever language they're living in. So whether it's Polish or it's Russian or it's Romanian, or whatever it is, right? But what happens? The opposite happens. Mendele gives up writing. He's always writing in both Hebrew and Yiddish, but he writes predominantly in Yiddish, and he becomes one of the foremost Yiddish writers of the early modern period. So let's go back. All right. This is another little piece from Fischke. He's talking to a friend he runs into. Can we get another volunteer? Anybody?
I'll be glad to.
Thank you, Felice. I hope
Yes,
it's big enough. Can you see it?
yes.
Okay.
There's no title, but
No, it's just from
it's
the
part of
dedication.
it's part of the story that, okay. Yes, you and I began our literary work at the same time, though our fortunes diverged.
He's talking to an old schoolmate from Cheder.
Ah. You took up lodging, as it were, in the upper story, amongst the quality, dealing there with the most valued treasures of Jewish history, setting out for display only the richest jewels of our people's past, their best, their proudest artifacts. Your business has been with the likes of Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Akiva. Your custom with our worthiest notables, and only our exalted luminaries bear your company. Whereas my lot has taken me below stairs, down into the cellars of Jewish life. My stock in trade, rags and cast-offs. I have merely to do with paupers and tramps, ragamuffins and rogues, and such other poor human oddments as may come to net, little folk to a man, small fry and smaller beer. Beggars are the stuff of my dreams, catching bags, the constant subject of my reveries. Whither I turn, wherever I look, that shabby article looms before me, like the string of umbles dangling at the end of a mournful boobie's nose, in the adage that lumbering bag of slim pickings and rag and bone charity our people have been shouldering since time out of mine is never out of my sight.
Is he being critical of anybody here?
I
Remember,
didn't get the impression of critical as much as these are people that he mingles with, the poorer, downtrodden people. And it's okay with him to do so.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He's living amongst the poorest of the poor. A catching bag, by the way, is a bag a beggar carries to collect whatever he can collect in the way of bits and pieces of food or whatever else. But he is criticizing somebody. You know, that upstairs, downstairs image he creates,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yes.
Who's he talking about? Who's upstairs?
Quality, the people who were probably much richer are upstairs.
It could be the quality, but the quality that he's referring to is he's referring to, no, that's wine and candles, I'm sorry. He's referring to the quality of the text they're studying, right? He's talking to an old acquaintance from a long time ago who went to Cheder in yeshiva with him. And his business is in the quality texts, right? The rabbis, the ancient rabbis of the Talmud, Hillel and Meir and Akiva,
Oh, yes.
right?
Mm.
And our exalted luminaries keep him.
Ah.
Whereas Mendele, he's hanging out not with the luminaries. Oh my goodness. Oops. I've lost the Zoom screen. He's hanging out not with the luminaries, but with the everyday and the poorest of the poor. I think that he's buried in this very amusing description, a criticism of the rabbinic leadership of the communities
Mm.
who are not taking care of the poor,
Oh,
and the masculine as well. The Enlightenment philosophers and teachers who are talking all about education, but they are associating with the middle class. And the middle class is exploiting the poor, not taking care of them. And he creates this really sharp commentary built into this description. Yeah, I'm just a poor guy, you know, I hang out with the beggars. You hang out with the luminaries, the great treasures of our tradition. And in between the lines, and you don't give a hoot about the poor people. Whether you're a maskil or from the yeshivas, the poor people are left out in the cold and on their own. So that's a little taste of Mendele. And this is a slide about Yud Lamed Peretz, I.L. Peretz, also born in the middle of the 19th century. He's from Poland, not from Ukraine. And he was one of the trifecta, the three great writers who created the Yiddish language and Yiddish literature that we study now when we say we're studying Yiddish. He also had a traditional as well as a secular education. He was a maskil in the beginning, but rejected the Haskalah philosophy and became a socialist. He also felt that the maskilim, the Haskalah philosophers, and also the great rabbis of the Hasidic tradition and the other traditions were ignoring the needs of the common folk. And he became a socialist. Remember I showed you that slide of the timeline? And I said, there's something I added to the timeline. On the timeline, it shows us that in 1897, a new organization was founded. Anybody know what super important Jewish organization was created in 1897? Should I go back to that slide?
a wild guess, B'nai B'rith.
It's a good guess, but it's not right. So instead of guessing, let's just go back to the timeline. 1897, what have we got going on here? Can you guys see it?
Jewish Labor Bund.
That's on the top. Right here in the middle, 1897 First Zionist Congress. So there were three sort of basic movements during this period of time. One is the Maskilim, the Haskalah says, don't go anywhere, assimilate. Assimilation doesn't really do the Jews a lot of good. So the Zionists come along and say, no, we're going to emigrate. We're all going back to Israel. And Yud Lamed Peretz and the socialists come along and say, no, we're not going anywhere. And we're also not going to assimilate. We're going to create the Jewish Labor Bund. And it's really interesting, the socialist movement, that the socialists started their organization the same year as the world, the WZO, the World Zionist Organization. It's all coming to a head at this point in time. And three different directions that we can sort of choose to go in. Sorry, I have to page through all this stuff. Oops. So we have Peretz, And because we don't have we have till 7:30, right?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe we will take a quick look at, he wrote a lot of poetry and short stories. And we are at Peretz, and he wrote a little story called The Golem. Peretz, like Mendele and like lots of the writers of his time, drew on the Yiddish folklore tradition. And if we were doing this over way more than an hour or so here, an hour or so there, we'd actually take a look at a lot of the Jewish folk tales and sources for some of these stories. So anybody want to volunteer to read this short story? It's just these 2 paragraphs here, 2 sides of the page.
I'll read it, but it's awfully small.
Unfortunately, let me try to make it a little bit bigger on my screen.
Okay.
Can you see it better?
Yes.
That's why I did it in,
I.L. Koretz. Great men were once capable of great miracles. When the ghetto of Prague was being attacked and they were about to rape the women, roast the children, and slaughter the rest, when it seemed that the end had finally come, the great Rabbi Leib put aside his went into the street, stopped before a heap of clay in front of the teacher's house, and molded a clay image. He blew into the nose of the golem, and it began to stir. Then he whispered the name into its ear, and our golem left the ghetto. The rabbi returned to the house of prayer, and the golem fell upon our enemies, threshing them as with flails. Men fell on all sides. Prague was filled with corpses. It lasted, so they say, through Wednesday and Thursday. Now it is already Friday. The clock strikes 12, and the golem is still busy at its work. Rabbi, cries the head of the ghetto, the golem is slaughtering all of Prague. There will not be a Gentile left to light the Sabbath fires or take down the Sabbath lamps. Once again, the rabbi left his study. He went to the altar and began singing the psalm, a song of the Sabbath. The golem ceased its slaughter. It returned to the ghetto, entered the house of prayer, and waited before the rabbi. And again, the rabbi whispered into its ear. The eyes of the golem closed, the soul that had dwelt in it flew out, and it was once more a golem of clay. To this day, the golem lies hidden in the attic of the Prague synagogue, covered with cobwebs that extend from wall to wall. No living creature may look at it, particularly women in pregnancy. No one may touch the cobwebs, for whoever touches them dies. Even the oldest people no longer remember the golem. Though the wise man Tzvi, grandson of the great Rabbi Leib, ponders the problem, may such a golem be included in a congregation of worshipers or not? The golem, you see, has not been forgotten. It is still here, but the name by which it could be called to life in a day of need, the name has disappeared. And the cobwebs grow and grow, and no one
may
touch them.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So, Yud Lamed Peretz, he had a traditional as well as a secular education, became a maskil for a while, a member of the Enlightenment, rejects the Enlightenment and becomes a Jewish socialist. He's using a very traditional folktale, but has he changed it? What's he trying to teach us? Any ideas? Remember, the rabbi whispered a secret, and mystical name into the golem's ear to raise it up to protect the Jewish community, and a secret mystical word to lay it back down again when it had finished protecting the community. So what's protecting the community now?
Well, it sounds to me like a revenge fantasy. That obviously Jews don't have the power to stop people from imposing pogroms on them. And so this is this kind of fantasy, which actually we did a whole workshop doing golems a few weeks ago. And it's interesting because we did it with comic books as the background, because this really leads right to the superheroes that were, I think, I'm just like guessing, that at least the superheroes that were the subject of the comics that were written by Jews. Again, this kind of fantasy of power that they didn't have. So that's kind of what I see here.
But in the story of the golem, who's the real hero? Is it the golem?
It's the rabbi who.
It's the
Makes
rabbi
sense.
who raises him up and controls him.
Yeah.
But with the rabbi gone, what happens? The rabbi's learning is gone. And how are the Jews going to protect themselves?
Right.
Now, unlike Rabbi Nachman, who gave us the moral of the story at the bottom, Yud Lamed Peretz leaves it up to us and says, we are going to have to protect ourselves. Our old ways and our old traditions are not available to us anymore. They no longer have potency. We have to figure out a new way to protect ourselves. And one of the things about the Bundists, the Jewish socialists, is that they not only encouraged education, but they encouraged physical fitness. They encouraged health. They encouraged education. They encouraged people to be physically, emotionally, and educationally, intellectually strong. They had quite a program going on. And I'm skipping through a bunch of stuff. So this is a picture of Peretz. And remember I mentioned that I went to a Yiddish shul where I learned to read and write Yiddish as a native speaker. It was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and the school was called the Yud Lamed Peretz Abedring Shule. Our school had the honor of being named after Yud Lamed Peretz. It was always considered a great honor by all of us. There are many more stories we could read. I have books of stories and books of literature and narrative. But there is another way that Yiddish language started to be used in the middle of the 19th century to convey very powerful ideas. And that was in poetry. So let's take a breath. Everybody take a stretch. And I have a few poems for us by the great Yiddish writers of, the 19th and early 20th century. We're speeding along into the 20th century, because next week we will be smack solidly in the 20th century, when we'll look at newspapers, radio, and cinema, and theater. So the first poet that I would like, is everybody taking a breath from this kind of roller coaster ride we're taking through story and poetry? And the first poet that I'd like to show you, just one poem by Morris Rosenfeld. Now, we've seen Ukrainian nationals, we've seen, and Polish nationals. Morris Rosenfeld was from Poland. He immigrated to London and then to New York, and he was a tailor. And he wrote some pretty strident material. I'm going to stop sharing here and go back here. And here's Morris Rosenfeld. This is a dual language edition of modern Jewish poetry, called it the Penguin. Here it is. It's the Penguin Book of Modern Yiddish Verse, and it is a dual language edition. So here is the Yiddish, and here is the English. And there are many times when I read the Yiddish and the way the translators have translated them, and I say to myself, that's not what it says. this one seems, but the translation is an art. It's not a science. And so, yeah, actually, there are places here where it does seem like that. But it's another writer who is like Mendele and like Yudlamit Peretz, turning away from the wealthy classes, the middle classes, and the upper classes, and turning their attention to the ordinary and the common people, the Yiddish speakers. So, anybody want to read a poem?
I'll go ahead and read it if no one else is going to do it.
Okay, thank you.
The sweatshop, corner of pain and anguish. There's a worn old house, tavern on the street floor, Bible room upstairs. Scoundrels sit below and all day long they souse. On the floor above them, Jews sob out their prayers. Higher on the third floor, there's another room. Not a single window welcomes in the sun. Seldom does it know the blessing of a broom. Rottenness and filth are blended into one. Toiling without let up in that sunless den, nimble-fingered and, or so it seems, content, sit some 30 blighted women, blighted men, with their spirits broken and their bodies spent. Scurf head struts among them, always with a frown, acting like his royal highness in a play. For the shop is his, and here he wears the crown, and they must obey him, silently obey. That's grim.
Yeah. Yeah, he told it like he saw it. He worked in the sweatshops, and he told it like he saw it. What was the life of somebody who worked in a sweatshop like?
Mhm.
Right?
Still today.
Still today. That's really the sad part.
Mhm.
Really the sad part. Does he create a picture?
Yep.
Yeah. You guys can unmute yourselves.
What does scurf head mean?
So, in fact, what it says here is Dorten geht darum sich Motke Parch Abezer spielen die Rolle von a ganzen Kisse. He's playing the role of a his name is Motke Parach Abezer. Scurf head means he's got a head full of skin condition. A parach is like heavy dandruff or flaky.
Ew.
He's really disgusting.
Yeah.
He's like really, really disgusting. But he runs the sweatshop. It's his, kingdom. And he rolls. Und den Musen folgen on a Taine. And we have to obey without complaint.
Sounds like China.
It sounds like any place where workers are abused. And the Yiddish poets and writers cared about this. They cared about it a great deal. So I'm flipping back and forth between.
I have a question.
Sure, please.
Is that in the United States?
It's
supposed to be?
interesting. I was not able to determine exactly when this particular poem was written, but it could easily have been in London or in the United States. But he did work as a tailor in clothing factories in New York, and it could have been there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. There. Next poet. She looks lovely, doesn't she? Her name is Rachel Koch, and she was born in 1898. So she's another one of these people on the cusp, right between the 19th and the 20th centuries. And You can learn a lot about her life just by looking at her dates. Born in 1898, she passed away in 1982 in Montreal, which means that she survived both world wars. And her poems are filled with images of nature, unlike the images we saw in Rosenfeld's poem. Originally she was writing in Polish, and she was also a member of the Haskalah. But after, in 1919, after the First World War, the brutality of it really moved her to take on writing in Yiddish, promoting Yiddish, being a Yiddish mentor, and introducing new characters. Oops, there's a typo. Ignore that, please. She promoted Yiddish culture and introduced new characters into her poems, and especially women. Nobody was writing about women. We haven't seen a woman character yet since Gluckel in the early 17th century. She was a displaced person during the Shoah and escaped to the Soviet Union as a refugee. Many people did that. When she learned that her entire family had died in the Holocaust, she emigrated to Montreal. She wrote narratives and stories, and her poems were very narrative and lyrical, but they started to be the kinds of poems where she would explore her memories of things that happened. And her poems are also quite sad. So if you're game, we'll take a look at one or two. The other side of the poem. There are all of these things on the other side of the poem. She's on this side. She's living in the here and now. The other side of the poem is a place of fantasy and of memory. An orchard with a house with a roof of straw and watchmen who stand guard. Birds and a path. So that's a very interesting verse. She says on the other side of the poem, there is a path as thin as a hairline cut, very narrow path. And someone lost in time is treading the path barefoot without a sound. Amazing things can happen on the other side of the poem. Even on this overcast day, this wounded hour that breathes its fevered longing in the window pane. On the other side of the poem, right, memories of her mother. My mother may appear and stand in the doorway for a while lost in thought, and then call me home as she used to call me home long ago. Enough play, Rachel, don't you see? It's night. Any reactions? Rabbi Singer, did you say something?
Yeah, who are these watchmen, these men? That's kind of creepy.
Or reassuring, right? This is someone who lived through 2 world wars. It would have been nice to have people guarding the house. Whether the house is the person or the family or the country or the community, it would have been nice to have people guarding.
True, but I don't know, she's got wounded hour in there, so it doesn't
And
sound.
people lost in time. Carolee, were you going to say something?
Well, the very end of it to me sounds like the mother is in heaven and waiting for her to come to her after she dies. It was, to me, very sad at the end. It's like waiting in the doorway for her to come.
She's a very sad person. She's
It's a beautiful use of language, though.
Yeah. Yeah.
The window pane. I don't have it in front of me anymore, but
Oh, I can bring it back up again. I can actually bring it up in a version that's easier to
as we say in the news business, she's very good with her nouns and verbs.
yeah. Right. Right. Which verse were you looking at, Ezra? The wounded
Well,
hour.
I particularly like on the other side, amazing things may happen. even
Mhm.
on this overcast day. The wounded hour that breathes in fevered longing, its fevered longing in the window pane.
Mm. It's an amazing image, this idea of the other side of the poem, right? All of the memories, all of the fantasies, all whatever it is that's going on in the head. When you write the poem and you put the words on paper, you concretize them. And they're now very different from all of that whole other world that's on the other side of the poem. There are many, many wonderful ways of interpreting this, and everything you guys have said. She does have a beautiful way with language.
Even in English.
Even in English. The translator did a very nice job with it.
Yes, he did.
Really very nice. So there's one more poet I would really like us to take a look at. And he's our last poet for the evening, and his name is Itzik Munger. And he's a Romanian Jew. I guess I have a sweet spot in my heart for him because on my mother's side, we are Romanian Jews. Born in 1901. Actually, people, there's some disagreement as to whether he was born in 1900 or 1901, but he puts himself squarely into the 20th century by claiming to have been born in 1901 in Chernovitz, Romania. He dies in 1969 in Tel Aviv, but he has been everywhere in between. Another one of those people who has, questions? Another one of those people who survived both world wars, son of a tailor, sent to a German high school, but got kicked out for bad behavior, and worked in his father's tailoring trade for a while. But a little bit like Rabbi Nachman, he was an enfant terrible, but in his own way. He adapted the traditions of Yiddish folk song and Yiddish theater. Next week, we're going to see some clips from a Yiddish film from the 1930s. And Itzik Munger actually wrote the lyrics to the songs. One of his best known works is called Medrash Yitzchak, or Medrash Itzik, also called Chumash Lieder. Medrash is Midrash, and these are Itzik's Midrashim. All of the writers that we are looking at were schooled in the traditional texts of the Jewish tradition. They knew Talmud, they knew Gemara, they knew Chumash, they knew Bible, and they knew the stories. He actually served in the Romanian army. Went after the First World War, he went to Warsaw, and he became famous at a very young age, and was at the 2 years later, at the age of 29, inducted into the Yiddish Pen Club. Close friends with Isaac Bashevis Singer and other well-known Jewish writers and luminaries. He moved to Paris, and then after the German occupation of Paris, he got himself out and went to London. Eventually, he wound up in New York, but he made several visits to Israel, and eventually he moved there and stayed in Israel the rest of his life. And he combined the folk images and the folk motifs with a very modern way of looking at the world. We're going to look at a poem from Chumash Lieder from his Midrash, his personal Midrash, which was written, one of my sources said 1935 is when he composed Chumash Lieder, but another source says he wrote this particular poem in 1940. So that's during the war. And then a poem he wrote in 1958 before one of his trips to Israel. And given his background and the people he kept company with, I was surprised that he ultimately did move to Israel. But what he says about that experience is very interesting. So let's take a look at the poem on moving to Israel first, because we're running close out of time. Now, I will tell you that this poem is titled by the translator. His name is Leonard Wolf, and I don't know who the translator is. For years I wallowed, right? And for years I wallowed about in the world. But in Yiddish, the word is hab sich Jahren gewalgert in der Fremd. Gewalgert doesn't convey what I think of when I think of the word wallow. Wallow sounds kind of like self-pity. Vulgar means to roam almost without purpose, like a homeless person, someone who has no place to be and nothing. In der Fremd, our translator chooses the word world, but Fremd means strange, unfamiliar, in alien places. In the unknown, fremd. A fremder is a stranger. Jetzt vor ich sich walgern in der Heim. And now I am going to walger, to roam in this unsettled way at home. So if you'll allow me to read the poem in English, just for the sake of time, and I'll stop trying to correct the translator, who knows way more about Yiddish than I do, I'm sure. For years, and I'm going to use wander instead of wallow because it just doesn't, the contemporary understanding of that word just doesn't work for me. For years, I wandered about in the world. Now I'm going home to wander there. In Yiddish, it says, ein Purschich, with one pair of shoes and one shirt, the shirt on my back, and the stick in my hand that goes with me everywhere. I'll not kiss your dust as that great poet did, though my heart like his is filled with song and grief. How can I kiss your dust? I am your dust. And how, I ask you, can I kiss myself? Still dressed in my shabby clothes, I'll stand and gape at the blue Kinneret like a roving prince who has found his blue, though blue was in his dream when he first started. I'll not kiss your blue. I'll merely stand silent as a Shemoneh Esrei prayer myself. How can I kiss your blue? I am your blue. And how, I ask you, can I kiss myself? Musing, I'll stand before your great desert and hear the camels' ancient tread as they sway with trade and Torah on their humps. I'll hear the age-old hovering wander song that trembles over glowing sand and dies, and then recalls itself and does not disappear. I'll not kiss your sand. No, and 10 times no. How can I kiss your sand? I am your sand. And how, I ask you, can I kiss myself?
Beautiful.
He has a way with words. He really does. Do you know who he's referring to when he talks about the great poet who kissed the dust, who wrote a poem about going to Israel and said how he was going to kiss the dust? He's talking about Yehuda Halevi.
Ah.
So he knows Yehuda Halevi, and he knows him well enough to write a poem that is structured around the various paragraphs of this poem by this early Renaissance, late medieval Jewish poet. He talks about my heart is in the East. And he talked, it's called My Heart is in the East. And he can't go, but he wants to. And he talks about how when he gets there, he's going to kiss the ground. And why do you think that Itzik Manger is saying, I am the dust? And yes, I'm going home, but I'm still wandering. Why is he saying, I am the dust, I am the sand, I am the blue? What's he trying to convey? Any ideas? Anybody? I'm gonna stop the share so we can see each other.
Well, of course, there is a biblical reference to being dust and ashes.
There's a biblical reference about dust and ashes. There's another biblical reference about sand too.
Being as many as the sands of the sea,
Right,
promised to Abraham.
right. The promise to Abraham. Right. It is full of biblical references, but in a way we've never seen before.
What's the year of this poem?
1958.
So it's after Israel has become a state, but I guess there's still this sense of uncertainty as to whether or not we'll be able to hang on to it because of the hostility of the surrounding communities.
And it's not that long. Yeah, absolutely, Rabbi. And it's also not that long since the war ended. And he was a totally displaced person.
Mhm. And it's only, I think, since the 67 war that we started to feel like, okay, we can defend ourselves. We're going to stay here. We're not going to be kicked out, or we're not going to be sent into the sea. So this is still a period of uncertainty, and it's always uncertain. We've got Iran, getting nuclear power, and that's very threatening. And we, even I just read an article about during the soccer matches, apparently a lot of Arab countries were bringing out the Palestinian flag. And so there's that whole thing still going on. And the fact that, the West Bank is kind of heating up, and there've been some terrorist acts inside Israel. So, we're always sort of like not sure. And then here we are in this country feeling very, very sure. And look what's happened in the last few years.
Yeah, yeah. But he's carrying, the baggage of being a displaced person with him, even when he's going home.
Right.
Israel becomes his home. But, and having grown up in a displaced person's community, in a refugee community, survivor community, those of us who grew up that way, we know that they called this home, and it was home, and yet the word home was never really quite real for the survivor community.
Right, right.
It just hard to believe, hard to accept, and it wasn't home. It wasn't the Haim. But what was home? What was Eastern Europe for Jews? We had three solutions: assimilate, lose our identity as Jews, emigrate, go live in Israel, right? Or stay and somehow figure out how to keep a separate identity and be accepted and integrated, which, that was the Jewish socialist kind of idea, and they had a really hard time with it. So I'm going to share my screen once more, just so that I can show you what we're going to do next week. And Rabbi Singer, I will send you a description of next week's class so that you'll have it. It's again a taste of Yiddish culture, and you'll notice that the picture of the ghetto is gone, and that was actually the original pictures I was using were the Lower East Side with signs in English and Yiddish. But now we're in a digital world. We've got our books, most of which are digital, and we're going to look at a little bit of Bintel Brief from the Jewish Daily Forward. We're going to look at Yiddish radio programs, movies, and some stuff on the internet, if I can squeeze it all into 90 minutes.
And you'll send us also the handouts so that people have copies. Yeah, that'll be great.
I will send you the handouts, and one of those handouts will include the other poem. I'm just going to show you real quick that poem by Itzik Manger called Eve and the Apple Tree. And it is a very different understanding of what happens in Eden, in Gan Eden, when Eve between Eve and the apple and the tree.
Wonderful.
I'll send that to you as well.
Great.
So stop share and
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And
Thanks,
we'll
Rabbi.
look forward to seeing you next week. Same
yes,
time, same place.
same time, same place. And thank you, everybody. I really do hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, it's just the tip, the teeny tip of the iceberg of all the wonderful material. And next week, there will be more multimedia. It won't be just us talking and reading. There'll be some, we'll mix it up with a little music and some things to entertain us as well.
Great. All right. Good
Thank
night, everyone.
Good night,
Nice.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you.
was really good, really interesting.
Oh, good.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad. I'm glad. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Good night.
Night.